So, so if we look at the Parshiot, so Bereshit clearly is concerned with the creation of the world and eventually the destruction of the whole world. Parshat Noach clearly focuses on what you might call a second creation, with Noach being a partner with God in this new creation. Parshiot Lech Lecha and Vayera essentially outline the relationship between Abraham and God, where the bookends are the initial Lech Lecha and then the second Lech Lecha, which is in the Akedah. Parshat Chayei Sarah is actually a transition parsha, where we're in fact, Abraham is now consolidating everything that he has built up to be able to then pass it on to the next generation. Parshat Toldot, contrary to what many people tend to focus on, which is the sibling rivalry between Yaakov and Esav, Parashat Toldot is really telling us about the life story of Yitzchak, okay, and what you might say, his contribution to the Jewish people. And this leads me to our Parashat Vayetze, and next week, Parashat Vayishlach, which essentially, the two Parshiot are really giving me an insight into Yaakov, into Jacob. And although we saw Jacob in last week's Parsha, specifically in relationship to Esav, to get a sense of who Jacob really is, I think we have it from our Parsha. And so let me begin with, and I hope everybody has the source sheets that were sent out. If you don't have the source sheet, I just want to point out it's enough for you to have a chumash and just follow along. It's true that I have a number of commentaries, but whatever I have, I will explain, and you can look it up at your leisure, get the source sheet at your leisure. So let's begin. The opening verse in our Parsha, this is chapter 28, verse 10. Okay, for those of you who have the source sheet, my first reference. Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva, vayelech Haran. Yaakov left Beersheva, and he goes to Haran. And there's in fact a difficulty over here, which is that already in last week's Parsha, we were told that Yaakov in fact left Beersheva. Okay, and you could see this for those of you who have a Chumash, chapter 28, verse 7, where it says, and Jacob listened to his father and mother, and he goes to Padan Aram. So this is an issue which bothers the Midrash, and Rashi in his opening comment says that, and I don't have it on my source sheet, do not have it, that, well, why do we repeat this? So he says, because it's coming to teach you that when a tzaddik leaves a place, the glory of the place leaves as well. So it's a very nice idea, but I think the simple way of understanding it is that it's a literary device. And it's a literary device which is now creating, in a certain sense, the heading for, as I said, the story of Jacob. And Jacob's story is the move from Beersheva to this place called Haran. So first of all, let me begin by saying that very often we have descriptions in the Torah of what we would call geographical movements. And by the way, I would say parenthetically, I think it's true in life in general, that sometimes people will go from place A to place B, but it's much more than just going from one place to another. That going from one place to another has very, very great implications in terms of who you are. what I would call, it's not just a geographical movement, it's an existential movement. And this is essentially what we have in our opening verse. Namely, Yaakov leaves Beersheba and goes to Haran. And so I would like to begin by saying, what is the significance of these two places? Beersheba was a very prominent place, both in the life of Abraham and Yitzchak, and I would say even especially in terms of Yitzchak. Beersheba is the place where, in a certain sense, there is this revelation of God. In Beersheba, it's where Yitzchak actually makes a peace treaty with the surrounding Philistines, with Avimelech, where they actually say, we have seen God is with you. For Yaakov, Beersheba symbolizes the place where God is manifest, where God has made the desert bloom. What is Haran? It's actually interesting. There's a Rashi which appears at the end of Parshat Noach, where he says Haran is related to the word Charon Af, which means anger. It's a place where God is angry. But for our purposes, I would say Haran symbolizes the place where it seems to be that God is absent. And this is the move which, in effect, is characterizing the life of Jacob. Namely, leaving a place where God is so manifest, to reality where God seems to be totally absent. And this is what Jacob has to deal with in his life. How does he discover God? And what I would say is, what is his place in a world where it seems to be that God is absent? Okay, and without being pejorative or, being judgmental in any way, so people should not take this negatively. Jacob, in many ways, encapsulates. He is the symbol for what we would call the Galut Jew. Jacob, although Jacob does not spend the bulk of his life in the Galut, from our perspective, his life, his adult life, what he accomplishes with his life, happens in the Galut. And that's essentially our Parsha. And this is a question of how does Jacob cope with the Galut? Now, if we look at the very next verse, chapter 28, verse 11, it says, Vayifka b'makom, and Jacob encounters the place. Vayal and Sham, he lodges there, kiva shemesh, because the sun is set. Vayikach me'avnei makom vayasem ra'ashotav, and he takes from the stones in this place, puts it around his head. He sleeps there. He has the very, very famous dream, right, of the ladder, of angels going up and down the ladder. And then God appears to him. And God says to him, okay, and this is verse 13, 14, 15, where God says to him, I am Hashem, the God of Abraham, your father, the God of Isaac. Okay, the land which you are sleeping on, I'm giving to you and your children. Your children will be, excuse me, like the dust of the earth. They will burst forth, okay, west, east, north, south, and all the families of the earth will be blessed in you and your seed. Okay, now I just want to point out the language over here is very much reminiscent of the language that we find in chapter 12, which are blessings which God gives to Abraham. I mean, it's a combination of 12 and 21. We're not going to go into that right now, but it's the idea that, and that's why also perhaps why it says, I am the God of your father Abraham, because there are many, many parallels between Jacob and Abraham. And over here, in a sense, in effect, what God is doing is giving Jacob the blessing of Abraham, so that if in the previous parsha, okay, it says that Isaac gave Isaac gave Jacob the blessing of Abraham. This is at the very end of last week's parsha. Here is God who's reinforcing that. But I want to focus, we're not going to talk about the ladder today, and I want to focus on one point. And by the way, what I'm about to say will have implications for the vision of the ladder, but you can figure this out. The essential message of this vision is what you have in verse 15, where God says to Jacob, behold, Hinei Anochi imach, I am with you, and I will guard you wherever you will go. V'hashivoticha, and I will return you to this land. Ki lo e'ezovcha, I will not leave you. Ad asher asiti et asher dibarti la, until I've done whatever I've told you. The essential message which God is giving Jacob is, I am with you. Wherever you will be, I am with you. I will not abandon you. Okay, I apologize, I didn't bring you the continuation of this, but I'll just mention that if you look in a few verses subsequently, verse 17, it says that when Jacob wakes up, it says, Vayira vayomar, he is in awe, and he says, Ma nora hamakom hazeh, how awesome this place is. Now, let me point out, the place where Jacob is, as we learn subsequently, is a place called Beit El. Beit El is in the land of Israel, so that Jacob has not left the land of Israel. Jacob is on his journey. Jacob has left Beersheba. For those of you who know the geography of Israel, Beersheba is in the south, Beit El is north of Jerusalem. That's clearly the route that he would take to eventually get to Haran, which is in Syria. Okay, you would go essentially through Israel, what today is Lebanon, then go east through Syria, so that Jacob is on his way. And what I want to point out is Jacob says how awesome the place is. The place is awesome in that Jacob never expected to necessarily have this encounter with God. And that's what makes it awesome. And what makes it so significant is that this then becomes a lesson to Jacob, that even where you least expect it, God will be with you. God is there. And that is an extremely important message for Jacob. It's extremely comforting. And now I just want to go back a second. It's extremely important to realize that Jacob now is running away from his brother who wants to kill him, which is very, I think somebody should be muted over here because I'm hearing something. This is very, very intimidating to Jacob. Jacob is also going to a place which he knows will not be a picnic, as we will see in a few moments, which means that from Jacob's perspective, there's a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety. What's going to be? And you can even see that in Pasuk Yud Aleph when it says, Vayifga b'makom, which the rabbis see as Jacob praying, and that this is the verse where the rabbis say Jacob instituted evening prayers. The word for prayer is vayifka. For those of you who know modern Hebrew, the word pigua is when you have a terror incident, which means that Jacob is terrified. Jacob is very, very anxious. He's extremely concerned for his survival. That's why God's reassurance here is so critical. Even though you seem to be now leaving a place of God, in fact, the place is any place. God can be with you anywhere. And that's very, very reassuring to Jacob. And therefore, if you then look in reference number 2, which is the beginning of chapter 29. Okay, it says, Vayisa Yaakov Raglav. Jacob lifts up his feet. Vayelech Artsav Lekedem. He goes to the land of the people of the east, using the language of lifting up your feet, right? Even today we would say it's like he's light on his feet. He's really gung-ho now on going where he needs to go, which shows that somehow this vision which he has had has been very, very reassuring. By the way, I just want to point out parenthetically, excuse me, I can't resist this, but Jacob's vision is in a dream. And in fact, Jacob has a dream now. He has a dream later on in the Parsha. Dreams are very, very important to Jacob. And I'll just say this right now, and I'm sure people can identify with this, especially when your reality is very, very difficult. It's important to have a dream. It's important to have a vision, to be able to somehow see beyond your reality. And this is what I think comes across over here, that Jacob has that dream which he's going to be taking with him, which will enable him to overcome all of the challenges, all of the obstacles in his path. So now let's look at a very interesting story. And since we actually spoke about this 2 weeks ago, remember we spoke about how the whole story of finding a wife for Yitzchak, and why is it that the Torah goes into such great detail describing it? And we said essentially because there's a lot that you can learn from all that detail. So here you have a little story, which is not in such detail, but which also says a lot to be able to understand the reality that Jacob is encountering. So let's look at verse number 2. Jacob now comes to the place where he's intended to go. And it says, Vayar v'hinei ve'er basadeh. And behold, he sees a well in the field. V'hinei sham shlosha adrei tzon rotzim aleha. And there are 3 herds of sheep that are crouching down. Because it's from this well that they will give the sheep to drink. And there's a big rock, right? A huge slab that's on top of the mouth of the well. And all of the herds were, and I will translate this loosely, accustomed to gather there. And then they would remove the stone, which means the stone was there purposely, that no one has any right to take of the waters of the well unless everybody is there. And then they would water the sheep, and then they would return the stone to its place. Now that already is a kind of, I don't know if you want to use the term alarm bell, red light, that why is it that, in other words, you have to have the stone there, and why is it that you have to have everybody gather, okay? And the simple way of taking it is because you don't want to have anybody taking water unless everyone else is there, which means that people are very, very strict about their property, their rights. Okay, and given what we've said, I think on other occasions, there are certain echoes perhaps of stone. There's a certain idea over here that people are not necessarily so forthcoming and willing to, be kind, which by the way, parenthetically might also cast a certain light on, what Rivka did 2 parshiot ago. But in any case, let's now see the conversation which follows. Lahem Yaakov, and Jacob then says to the people who are waiting around, Achai me'ayinatem, my brothers, where are you from? Vayomru, and they say, Mecharan anachnu, we come from Haran. And then Jacob says, Vayomer lahem, hayadatem et Lavan ben Nachor, do you know this person? Vayomru, and they say, Yadanu, we know him. Vayomer lahem, and then Jacob says, Hashalom lo, is peace with him. Vayomru, shalom. V'hinei Rachel bito ba'a imatzon. And they say, peace. And here is Rachel, his daughter, who's coming with the sheep. Now, I purposely did it with the, sound effects, because if you look at what's going on over here is Jacob, and I could envision him as being somebody who has a big smile on his face, is trying to be very, very warm, effusive, and even calls them his brothers. My brothers, where are you from? Right? Now, by the way, you realize he's the stranger, they're the locals. It should have been the other way around. And what you see is that he asks them 3 questions, and each time it's like they're giving him the cold shoulder. They're very, very succinct in their response. And I even take it, but this could be my reading, that the 3rd time around, it's like, pieces with Lavan. And by the way, here's his daughter over there. Why don't you go bother her? Like, we don't want to waste our time with you. So you begin to get a sense of this environment that Jacob is coming to. It is not a friendly environment. I might even say it's a hostile environment. Okay? People are certainly not warm and welcoming. Okay? And if I add that to the fact, right, that you need everybody before you can take out any water from it, so that shows you how it seems to be that everybody is preoccupied with themselves and is not in any way interested in anyone else around them. So this is the initial welcome which Jacob gets to this place. And as we know, in the continuation of the section, Jacob sees Rachel, and she's beautiful, and this is like Hollywood, falls head over heels, and not only that, but then does this superhuman feat where he's able to take this huge rock, right, to impress Rachel, okay, and eventually waters the sheep, okay, and Jacob even does something which would seem very unseemly. I'm not sure how they teach this in Haredi circles. If you look at Pasuk Yud Aleph 11, it says, Vayishak Yaakov, he gives her a kiss. That's a little bit, too much. How could you give a strange woman, a kiss? So the Ibn Ezra, right, who's in the Middle Ages, so he says, well, he kissed her hand, right? He was just being a gentleman, okay? But in any case, we'll leave it at that. By the way, I'll just say parenthetically that evidently the Avot were not Haredi. But in any case, what you have over here is the following, that when he sees Rachel, and by the way, when he gives her the kiss, he does know that it's his cousin, but that wouldn't go over in Haredi circles today either. So in any case, he sees her, he starts crying. Okay, and I want to point out something, this idea, why is he crying? So there's an actually interesting comment by Rashi that says that he's crying because he sees in a prophetic vision that he won't be buried with Rachel, and what a bummer. Okay, but if we take the simple meaning, and here I brought you, I brought you Rashi, but I brought the second interpretation, right? I didn't bring the one about what he sees in a prophetic vision. So Rashi says, if you look down below at the bottom of the page, Davar acher shaba biyadayim rekaniyot. Why is he crying? Because he came empty-handed. Amar, he said, Eliezer Eved Abba, Eliezer, the servant of my father, meaning his grandfather. Hayu biyadon nizamim utzmitim. He had nose rings, he had bracelets. Vani ein biyadi klum, and I have nothing. Lefi sheradaf Eliphaz ben Esav, because Eliphaz, the son of Esav, pursued him. B'mitzvat aviv acharav lahorgo. That Esav's son was actually instructed to kill Jacob. He go and actually caught him. Ulefi shegadal Eliphaz b'cheiko shel Yitzchak, and because Eliphaz grew up in the bosom of Yitzchak, he didn't immediately kill him. Mashach yado, he pulled back his hand. Amarlo, but then Eliphaz says to Jacob, Ma eselet silui abi. What shalaba? What can I do? But my father told me to do so. Amarlo Yaakov. So Jacob said to him, Tol ma shebiyadi v'ha'ani chashuv kamei. So just take all my money. And a poor person is like one who's dead, which means that according to this interpretation, Esau actually tried to kill Jacob before he left. And he sent his son to do it. And according to this, he couldn't do it because of the respect he had for Yitzchak. But at the same time, he didn't want to, in a certain sense, disobey his father. So the compromise was to essentially take everything which Yaakov had taken with him as a kind of maybe dowry for the bride he was seeking. And in that way, we have a halachic principle. Somebody who's poor is like someone who's... So technically, it's like he killed Yaakov. But the point which I want to point out with all this is that evidently, Yaakov comes empty-handed, which we certainly see in another few verses. And this actually is a big problem for a lot of commentaries. How is it possible, that Yaakov came empty-handed when in the story with Abraham, we see how Eliezer brought all of these goodies. So this is one explanation. A second explanation might be that Jacob purposely did not take anything consciously. He could have taken, and maybe he was even given stuff to take, but he didn't want to take it because he was so anxious that Esau might be pursuing him that he didn't want to be loaded down with any material things. There's a third interpretation of the Ibn Ezra, but you can look at this at your leisure. I won't go into it now. That actually says that at this point in time, Yitzchak was poor. And then the Ibn Ezra goes into this whole thing about how it's possible for righteous people to be poor. Don't be surprised about that, which is more of a reflection on his life story than the text. But in any case, the point though, which I want to bring up is at this initial encounter, Jacob is not exactly somebody who was, in a position to make a great impression. He has nothing with him. And in fact, when Lavan comes to greet him, right, we're told in verse 13, Pasuk Yud Gimel, Vayhi cheshma Lavan et shema Yaakov ben achoto, when Lavan hears the news about Jacob, the son of his sister, right, his nephew who's just come, Vayarotz likrato, he runs towards him, Vaychabek lo, he hugs him, Vayinashek lo, he kisses him, Vayiveo el beito, brings him to his house, Vayisaper Lavan et kol advarim ha'el, and then Jacob tells him all these things. Vayomer lo Lavan, and then Lavan says, Ach atzmi v'sari ata, but you are my, excuse me, flesh and blood. And he settles down with him for a month. Okay, so now it's very striking over here, and I'm going to begin to go into this right now, because this is going to be important for the whole story of the parsha. Here is Lavan, who hears that Jacob is coming, and if you look at how he greets him, it's unbelievable. He hugs him, he kisses him, he runs there. Okay, he brings him into the house. It would seem to be that this is wonderful. Here is Lavan, his uncle, who is so warm, who is showing how excited he is to have Jacob. And one of the issues which comes out throughout the story is there, and I would say there is, but I'll just put it as a question, is there a gap between what seems to be and what really is? In other words, what do I mean by that over here? Here is Lavan, who's being so effusive, who's being so warm. Is that real? Is that genuine? Or is all of that actually a facade? And what I add, and even if it's genuine, quote unquote, is it because he really feels so overwhelmed and so excited to see his nephew? Or is it because he has a hidden agenda? Now, I didn't bring you in my source sheet. There's a very interesting Rashi that says that from beginning to end, and by the way, you'll see this as we go along, that Rashi has a tendency, certainly in Bereshit, but even beyond, that he tends to paint the good guys as being really good and the bad guys as being really bad. And so therefore, it's like Lavan is this bad guy. There can't be anything that he's doing which is really good. So as a result of that, Rashi says in his commentary, when Lavan is running towards him, why is he running? Because he's anticipating all the wealth which he is bringing with him, which he will then get. And then all of a sudden he comes, he runs, and then when he finally gets there, so he sees Jacob doesn't have camels, doesn't have any servants, has nothing. So then what does he do? He starts hugging him. Why? Because he's essentially feeling his body to see maybe he has like precious jewels or gold, right, hidden in his pockets. And then when that doesn't work, Vayanashik he kisses him because maybe he actually has some stuff that he's hiding in his mouth. So that according to Rashi, from beginning to end, all of this excitement, enthusiasm is only because Lavan is anticipating that here he is about to cash in. And Lavan also has a kind of precedent, because if the servant of Abraham came laden with so many gifts, how could it be that Jacob himself, right, who's the continuation of the line, would come empty-handed? Of course, he is the heir. He is the one who now should have much more at his disposal. And therefore, if you take Rashi's interpretation, that's why it becomes, a little bit of a bummer. And in the next pasuk, so Lavan says to them in 14, which I read, Ach atzmi v'sari ata. But you are my flesh and blood. You are blood. You are of my essence. What's the but? So clearly the but is a kind of disclaimer, right? Despite the fact that you have nothing, right? But you're my flesh and blood. What can I do? So stick around for a month, okay? He doesn't even say stick around for a month. It says that Jacob actually stays for a month. Now, if you don't take Rashi's interpretation that Lavan is, doing this body check and everything else, but nevertheless it says that he hugs him and everything else, and then Jacob tells him his story. So it's very interesting, what's the story that he's telling him? And so you have, certain commentaries who want to say that the story which he in effect is telling him is that, how he was running away. I mean, if you look on the second page, Rav Yosef Bechor Shor, he says that, he tells him the story about, how he got the birthright and how he is fit as a result of that to take Lavan's daughter, how he ran away from Esav, okay? And that's why he, in effect, is coming without anything, okay? And essentially what he's saying is that, well, I am really the heir, but I have nothing because I ran away from my brother. Now, I do have to say that, telling him that he ran away from his brother is not exactly going to ingratiate him with his potential father-in-law. But nevertheless, if I take that interpretation, and for me, it's actually very important because of what we're going to see as we continue, it will mean that Jacob is actually being very upfront with Lavan as to what is going on. He's not trying to whitewash anything. He's telling them about everything that had gone on, what are all the circumstances that led him here. He obviously is telling him things which are true, which would make him a good candidate, namely that he received the blessing, that he got the blessing of Abraham. But at the same time, he's also telling him the other stuff, which is that this was not a happy departure. Esav tried to kill him. So then he knows exactly where things stand. And if we take this interpretation, and I'm pushing this a lot, it says that from beginning to end, Yaakov tries to be upfront with Lavan. Okay, so now, as I mentioned, Lavan kind of begrudgingly takes Yaakov in, and he stays with him for a month. And Rashi points out, and even during that month, it wasn't a freebie, but that Yaakov, in fact, had to take care of his sheep, which once again would be saying perhaps something about Lavan. But now let's look at the story which everybody's familiar with. Okay, this is verse 15. Vayomer Lavan, chapter 29, 15, second reference. Vayomer Lavan liYaakov, and Lavan says to Jacob, Hachi achi ata, are you not my brother? Vavadatani chinam, are you going to work for me for nothing? Hagita li ma maskurtecha. Tell me, what do you want to be? What do you want your wages to be? Lavan shtei vanot, and Lavan had two daughters, right? An older one called Leah, a younger one called Rachel. And then it says in verse 18, Vayehav Yaakov et Rachel. Yaakov loved Rachel. Vayomer e'evodcha sheva shanim. I will work for you 7 years. Rachel bitcha haktana. For Rachel, your younger daughter. Okay? So now, let's begin with the first thing. Yaakov has 30 days where he's by Lavan. At that point, okay, it seems to be that Lavan then says to him, if you're going to stay around, we need to make some sort of business arrangement. Okay, so tell me, what would you like? Now, note the fact that Lavan does not at any point offer his daughters to Yaakov, even though if Yaakov tells him the reason for his coming, and we didn't say this before, but presumably the reason for his coming is to find a wife. So you would have expected that Lavan should say something about that, but he doesn't. Instead, what Lavan does is to simply treat him as a worker and say, okay, so we have to come to some sort of arrangement. So I'm just trying to show you, if you read a little bit between the lines, Lavan is in no way acting as family, okay? In no way is even offering in any way to an acknowledgement of the possibility of marriage. And therefore it's Yaakov who only brings it in through the back door, okay, as part of a business arrangement. And Yaakov offers to work for 7 years, which I think all of us would agree is a very, very long time. And he emphasizes Rachel bitcha haktana. And if you look at Rashi on the bottom of the page, so Rashi essentially asks, why does Yaakov have to be so exact when he says Rachel bitcha haktana? And Rashi says, because Yaakov knew that Lavan, shehu Ramai, is a cheat, is a liar. And if Yaakov says to him, I'll work for you, Yaakov said to him, I'll work for you for Rachel. But then Lavan could always come along and pick out somebody else who's called Rachel to give him to be his wife. So he had to emphasize, no, Rachel, your daughter. But then if he just said, Rachel, your daughter, so Lavan could have maybe pulled the fast one and said, well, we'll just switch names and we'll call Leah Rachel. So Yaakov had to make it perfectly clear what exactly he wanted. Now, I'm bringing this out because if you continue to read this parsha, you'll see that every time there is an arrangement, a business arrangement between Yaakov and Lavan, Yaakov always makes it perfectly clear exactly what the terms are. And what you'll see by the same token is that Lavan is not so careful. And therefore, if you look at Lavan's response, Lavan says to Yaakov in Pasuk Yutet, Vayomer Lavan says, Tov titi otalach, good that I should give her to you, mititi ota, leishacher, than to give her to another man. Shva imadi, sit with me. So what you find over here, which on the one hand seems to be that, yes, here is Lavan, who's agreeing to the terms that Yaakov laid out. Except that what's very important is that Lavan doesn't actually put it in his own words. Lavan never says, I will give you my daughter Rachel, my youngest, in return for you working for 7 years. And what I'm saying is because he puts it in such uncertain terms, it's good that she should, right, that I should give her to you. Well, does that mean you agree to my terms or not? Now, I just want to point out, as everybody knows, in the end, Lavan pulled the fast one over Yaakov. And Lavan can always come back and say, okay, I never, said that I wouldn't give her to you. I just never agreed exactly to the terms that you laid out. And this is, in fact, what Rav David Tzvi Hoffman says later on. Okay, and we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, by the way, I'll just point out, if you see on page 1, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, the second line, where he says, Tov titi otalach. So he says, K'mo kol ha'anashim ha'arumim. That Lavan was speaking like all kinds of crafty people. Kach mavtiach gam Lavan, so Lavan also promises, havtacha mu'orpelet, a very unclear promise. Ubilti brura, kedei shelo lichpol yadav, so that he doesn't chain his hands. He makes himself as if Jacob's proposal is very desirable, and something which he wants. Okay? And in so doing, he breathes in Jacob's heart this sense of confidence and goodwill on the part of Lavan. But then in the end, he essentially doesn't come through because he gave a very vague, and uncommitting response. And as we know, when the day comes, right, and Jacob has, and by the way, again, I just want to point this out, if we look, excuse me, in Pasuk Chaf 20, Jacob worked for 7 years, and it was like a few days, for his love for her. And then Jacob says to Lavan, give me my wife because I have completed my days, right? I have come through on my side of the bargain. I want to avoid that, which is a little bit vulgar. Like, give me my wife so I can come upon her, right? That's not the nicest thing to say. But I guess he knows who he's talking to, so he has to speak in his language. And he says, Vayom, and then Lavan then's response is, Vayitain Lavan. I'm sorry, where am I? Let me just find my place. Lavan 22 gathers everybody, they make a party, and then at night, Vayikach Lavan, et Leah bito, takes Leah, and he brings him to him, he comes upon her, he gives her his ta-ta-ta. Anyway, the point which I want to make is, from Lavan's perspective, there was no mistake over here. Lavan doesn't think twice about, after Yaakov says, give me my wife, to give him Leah, but that wasn't the agreement. And then when Jacob wakes up in the morning, discovers, right, there was a mistake. We won't go into how did he not know until he got up in the morning. Could leave that for another time. In any case, Jacob says, 25, what is it that you have done to me? Is it not that for Rachel I worked for you, and why did you deceive me? And Lavan's response in verse 26 is, Lavan says, Lo ye'asachem bimkomenu, we don't do this type of thing in our place. Latet hatzira lifnei habechira, to give the younger daughter before the older daughter. Malei shvuazot, finish up, and I'll translate this as a number of commentaries, finish up this week, right? I'm giving you a week to spend with Leah. V'nitnan lecha gam et zot, and I will give you also that one. Ba'avodah she'tavodi madi od sheva shnim achrot. I'll give you that one for another 7 years. Okay, now, let me also point out, forget about anything else. Does everybody notice that Lavan doesn't even talk about his daughters by name? This one, that one, like you could talk about Rachel, you could talk about Leah. You know that when you use the term zot or zeh, that's the way you point at an object, which means that if nothing else, what you see over here is that from Lavan's perspective, right, his daughters are simply objects, they're pawns. And that everything, and we've spoken about this, right? And when we talked about stone, possessions are more important than human beings. And human beings in Lavan's world are simply subordinated to possessions. So everything's about the business deal. So, and in fact, what Lavan essentially says to Jacob is, okay, you're getting Rachel. You just have to work another 7 years. And how do I justify it? Because we don't do things like this in our place. Because the custom, right, is that we first marry off the elder daughter, then the younger daughter. Now, I want to point out, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, right, who you have on the first page, says that, in fact, it could very well be that what Lavan is saying is true. And he, in fact, says that it was true that in many societies, right, you wouldn't marry off the younger daughter before the older, which, by the way, today, even in Haredi circles, is actually true. That they wait until the older daughter gets married. But even if that's true, what's the problem? He should have said that at the very beginning. It should have been clear. And this is what I want you to see, and since I see my time is really starting to run out, what essentially we see in this whole parsha is how Jacob is living in a reality in this parsha, a cold, hostile reality where swindling seems to be very common, or at least in the case of Lavan, where people are able to somehow get away with it because they tend to be very vague. And what we've seen about Jacob is Jacob seems to be very emotional. He's been described as somebody who falls in love. He seems to be very effusive. He seems to be, and what's even more important is that he's very, very upfront. He's very, very clear in all of his dealings. And what I would like to say now is, what we see throughout this parsha is the integrity of Jacob. And I point this out because in last week's parsha, many people have a big problem, myself included, in what you might see the underhanded tactics of Jacob. In the first story, right, with Esav who comes and he's starving to death, and it seems to be that here's Jacob who's kind of extorting him, taking advantage of a situation, right? Getting the birthright, right, when Esav is like, kind of very vulnerable. Certainly in the second story where he masquerades as his brother, deceives his father, right, to get the blessing. It is not a pretty picture of Jacob. And in fact, Esav himself says, is this why you called him Jacob? Because Jacob is from the language of the heel, the one who gets you by the heel, okay? Who seems to be the one who tries to find your weak point to take advantage of. And in our parsha, we have a completely different picture of Jacob. In our parsha, Jacob is the one who is vulnerable. And Jacob, excuse me for 1 second, please. Sorry about that. Okay. Jacob is the one who is vulnerable, and yet Jacob is the one who maintains his integrity from beginning to end. We find this right now. After Jacob, let's just move fast forward, right? To chapter 30, reference number 3. Chapter 30, verse 25. It says, when Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob comes to Lavan and says, send me away so that I will be able to now go back to my place and to my land. Give me my wives, my children who I have worked for you, and let me go, because you know the work which I did. Avodati asher avadeticha. So I want to point out a few things. If you look in reference number 3, the Rashbam says, when it says that, he says, Jacob, when he asks, send me away, he says that when Kiatak Shinolad Yosef, when Joseph was born, Nishlemu Sheva Shanim Achirot Shel Rachel. The 7 extra years that Jacob worked for Rachel were completed, which means that Jacob does not come to Lavan to ask to leave until he has fully fulfilled his agreement with Lavan. It's not just when Joseph is born, but as the Rashbam says in other commentaries, Joseph is born as Jacob completes his obligation. If you look at the Rashi, the next comment, when Jacob says, give me my wives and my children, Rashi says, Eini rotze latzeit ki im birshut. I want to get your permission. Theoretically, when Jacob fulfills his obligation, he has every right to just pick up and go. But he still doesn't want to do that. He wants to get Lavan's permission. There's an element of decency over here. Because yes, these are Jacob's wives and children, but they're also Lavan's daughters and grandchildren. And by the way, Jacob emphasizes at the end of Pasuk Chavav, you know the work that I did for you. And Rashi points out, what Jacob is saying to Lavan is, you know how faithful I was. You don't have any claims to me. So I want you to see that Jacob, throughout his dealings with Lavan, as I said, is very upfront. He fulfills his obligations. You might even say he goes beyond it in coming to Lavan, saying, I've done my job. Let's now say goodbye, have an amicable, right, severance, departure. And if you look at what Lavan's response is, Lavan says to him in verse 27, Vayomer elav Lavan says, if I have found favor in your eyes, nichashti, I have divined, Vayevarcheni Hashem biglalecha, that God has blessed me as a result of you. And then Lavan says in the continuing, tell me, set once again what your reward will be, and I will give it to you, right? Which in effect, Lavan is saying, I don't want you to leave me. And why doesn't he want him to leave him? Because Lavan realizes that in the time that Jacob was by him, he, Lavan, has benefited tremendously. And whether Lavan sincerely means this or not, he recognizes that the success of Jacob reflects that God is blessing Jacob. And Lavan is the beneficiary of that blessing. And therefore, he doesn't want to let him go because he wants to cash in on it. And then once again, he says to him, so you tell me, what's your reward? What do you want for you to stay on? And look at what Jacob says. And excuse me. And we'll look at Jacob's response in verse 29. Vayomer elav, he says to him, Ata yadata, you know et asher avadaticha, how I worked for you. Ve'et asher haya miknecha iti. And Jacob says, and you know how your cattle were by me. Ki ma'at asher haya lefanai, that before I came there was very little. Vayifrotz la'rov, and they have burst forth to become numerous. And God has blessed you as a result of me. And then Jacob says, and when will I now do for myself? And then Jacob goes on to give him the proposal. And there are some people who have a problem with it, right? Where he says to him, take all the spotted sheep, I'll take all your white sheep, and whatever spotted sheep are born from the white sheep will be mine. And he has this whole device of, taking a stick, which he makes spots on so that they inspire the sheep to have spotted children. Okay, we're not going to go into that. But what I want you to see once again, look at what Jacob says to Lavan. Lavan, I want you to acknowledge, when I came here, you had nothing. Now you have a tremendous amount because of my work, because God has blessed you as a result of me. Give me the opportunity now to become blessed in my own right. And he devises and he lays down the exact terms. And now I'm just going to skip to the end of that section, right? In chapter 30, verse 43, the last verse in number 3. Vayifrotz ha'ish ma'od, ma'od, the same word vayifrotz. And the man here being Jacob, bursts forth greatly. He has many sheep, servants, maids, camels, and donkeys, which means the end of the section describes how Jacob has become a very, very wealthy man. Okay? Now, I really apologize that my time is over, and I will really try to stick with it. And I'm sorry I didn't get to the other things, but you can then look at the next sections and see how they're a logical continuation of what we've done. So let me sum up. The point which I've been trying to show you is how this parsha is showing me Jacob's experience. And who is Jacob? And essentially, this parsha is showing me the integrity of Jacob. How Jacob, from beginning to end, is someone who's upfront, who is not deceptive, who is faithful and loyal. And despite the fact that he's in a framework of deception, a framework which is cold, which is hostile, he maintains his integrity from beginning to end. He tells it like it is. The second thing, which I think is worth noting, is despite the fact, as I said at the beginning of the shir, that Jacob leaves an environment where God seems to be so manifest, to go to an environment where God is so absent. But Jacob experiences God to the same extent in that environment. For those of you who look at last week's Parsha in chapter 26, verse 16, Yitzchak plants during a time of famine, produces 100-fold. Why? Because God blessed him. And as a result of that, Yitzchak becomes an extremely wealthy individual in last week's Parsha. And all of it is the result of the blessing of God. And one could say it's the fulfillment of the blessing which God made to Abraham, of the destiny of the Jewish people to become a people and a very significant people. Jacob has a similar experience in a different way, not through planting, but through shepherding. And he also becomes an extremely wealthy individual. And as Jacob and even Lavan say, this is the result of the blessing of God, which means that what God said to him at the beginning of the parsha, I will be with you, and that you will partake of the blessing of Abraham, comes to its actualization in this week's parsha. So that it's very clear that on the one hand, who is Jacob? A man of integrity, a man who is true to his word, who's loyal. And Jacob is also the one who God is looking out for, who will be the one to continue to perpetuate the destiny, the legacy of Abraham. You can see how this plays itself out in the end of the parsha, which is reference number 4. And as I said, unfortunately, we don't have the time to do this. I want to point out only one verse, and with that we will end. And this will be the segue to next week. There is only one thing which happens in this week's parsha, which is a flaw / blotch stain on Jacob. And if you look in reference number 4, which is, chapter 31, this is the last page that I have, chapter 31, verse 21. Actually, what I want to look at is verse 20. It's the second line on the 4th page. Verse 20 says, Vayignov Yaakov et Lev Lavan ha'arami, al bli higidlo kivareahu. That Jacob stole the heart of Lavan, the Aramean, that he did not tell him he's running away. Vayivrachu b'chol asher lo, he ran away with all that he had. Vayakum vayabor tanahar, and he crosses over the river, Which means, in chapter 31, there comes a point where God appears to Jacob and says to him, the time has come for you to go back, where Jacob gathers Rachel and Leah to, in a certain sense, get their permission, to get their agreement, their consent. And the last thing which should have happened is Jacob should have then gone to Lavan and said to Lavan, okay, God has appeared to me, and I fulfilled all the obligations which I've had to you. I am now going. Let me have your blessing. He doesn't do that. And instead, Jacob waits for an opportune moment where Lavan has gone off to essentially run away. And the language which the Torah uses is that Jacob stole the heart of Lavan, which is a very telling language, because the whole point of everything in the parsha is that Jacob does not steal. Jacob has integrity. Jacob is completely above board. So that this becomes, in a way, the stain on Jacob in this week's parsha. Which means that, yes, Jacob has developed, has grown. And this is the Jacob that in many ways, right, is fit to be the patriarch of the Jewish nation. But there's this one spot which somehow echoes the Jacob of last week's parsha, who's deceptive, who steals the heart of his father-in-law. We're going to talk about this more next week, and this will be the segue to the encounter next week between Jacob and Esav, which will be, in a certain sense, a complement to who is Jacob. I look forward to seeing you, and as I said, I apologize in advance that we didn't actually go through the last section, but for those of you who will continue with me next week, so we will actually look at the relevant parts of chapter 31 as it pertains to the beginning of next week's parsha. Shabbat shalom, everyone.